Well, let's now digest all of this week's biggest political stories, from more coronavirus restrictions being imposed both locally and nationally, to the fears that students might not get home for Christmas, and more issues with the NHS COVID-19 app. Let's discuss all these and more with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the deputy political editor for The Mail on Sunday, Anna Mikhailova. Join me this lunchtime. Good afternoon to both of you. Thanks a lot for coming and chatting to us on Sky News. Let's talk about university students first. You have to feel for the students, don't you? Sonia, what do you think?
Absolutely, you have to feel for them. Many of them are 18-year-olds in Scotland, 17-year-olds away from home for the first time. They were encouraged to return to university in order to get both face-to-face and online virtual teaching for the full university experience. And now this has happened, and we've got a situation where thousands of students are being required to self-isolate, many of them living in student halls where they're in tiny box rooms, some living with people that they don't know very well. And your heart just has to go out to them. And I think there are very serious questions for the government here, because this was entirely predictable. We had sage minutes warning that universities were going to become a hotbed of transmission. And I think there are big questions around why there wasn't a national strategy for universities. You've either got to make sure that there's regular mass testing, or I think there are questions to be asked about whether we should have had virtual learning this term. And indeed, that's what lots of academics have been saying should have happened in order to avoid this happening. Now, that's really tough, of course, for a cohort of young people were very affected by the A-level scandal. But I think it's kind of doing that and giving them a fee rebate and making sure that universities get financial bailouts for this term would have been better than ending up in this situation where you go to university, you're leaving home for the first time, and you're stuck isolating, in a tiny little room with nothing to do.
What do you think, Anna? Do you think that this has been really badly handled?
Well, I think everything that Sonia says is right. And also just to point out that they're paying thousands of pounds for the pleasure of sitting in their room, having online courses and not being able to go out and meet anyone. I think today there's quite a significant intervention by Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Committee, who says that the government universities need to start considering giving refunds to students who are stuck like this. I mean, we've got 3,000 students now self-isolating for this reason. And obviously all of this is mostly because the testing regime just isn't up to scratch.
Do you think, what do you think should happen now? Some are only starting this weekend. Should they just close all the universities, tell people, finish your isolation and go home? Anna?
Well, I think you need to start developing a system where if students are effectively tested, but obviously there seems to be little point of just sitting in a room, renting it, and actually not having any university experience or being able to study properly. So something needs to be done. I think ultimately, as many people have said time and time again, the only way out of this before we have a vaccine is to have an effective testing system in place.
It seems the answer to everything, doesn't it? Sonia, do you think this is what is being reflected here? Sorry, what did you want to say, Sonia? Go ahead.
Just wanted to sort of add to what Anna was saying. I think this is also very symbolic of the lack of care that government has shown for children and young people, going way back to March, whether it's the rate at which schools were reopening, the lack of free outdoor activities for children and young people over the summer. And of course, the A-level scandal with grades, that was predicted. The government didn't do anything to ward that off. They knew it was going to lead to problems with university admissions, with some universities being oversubscribed, some undersubscribed, and they didn't do anything. There was no national strategy. They just left it to individual universities to sort out. And that is, again, what we're seeing here. So I think there has been a total and utter lack of strategy from Gavin Williamson and the Department for Education in this pandemic. It just seems to be laissez-faire, let's just see how it goes, and hopefully it won't be too bad. And it just doesn't work when you're in the middle of a global pandemic.
If that is the case, Anna, what do you think? Why do we, every week almost, see a government decision that hasn't worked, possibly a U-turn? And why, 7 months into this pandemic, are we still seeing this happening?
Well, obviously, you do have to put it into perspective that a lot of countries dealing with this pandemic have also had to do U-turns and are scrambling around trying to find policies that could work. But you're right, it's sort of every week there's a different crisis, and obviously we're now seeing a resurgence in care homes as well. That needs to be talked about. We've got the huge problem of other illnesses that just aren't getting treated because people are afraid of going to hospital because they don't want to catch COVID, because services aren't running as normal. So all of this needs to be addressed. I mean, I think one of the reasons MPs are so keen to start pushing the government to put everything to votes, put lockdown decisions to votes in Parliament, is because there's a recognition that a lot of these crises aren't being well managed, and there needs to be more scrutiny and there needs to be greater accountability.
Do you think that is going to happen, Sonia, that this eventually it will just have to go to Parliament?
I think there is a good chance. So what we're seeing is sort of Conservative backbenchers saying they're going to bring forward legislation to try and force government to Parliament with more restrictions. And we might see a very unusual set of circumstances where you get the opposition parties voting with Tory backbenchers on that. So it's not certain that it's going to happen yet, but I think there is a chance that we see it happen. But I think if we take a step back from all of this, it's quite interesting. So I think that the coalition that is forming around that legislation, there are people who feel quite differently about it. So there are some Conservative backbenchers who feel that the government is acting too fast, and so they want a chance to sort of vote down these regulations. And then I think there are some MPs who perhaps feel that the government isn't acting quickly enough. And I think there are real questions, given that we've seen some very senior scientists on stage say that they don't feel that the nationwide restrictions that we've seen put in place, so for example the 10 p.m. curfew, the rule of 6, a lot of scientists seem to think that that doesn't go anywhere near far enough in order to significantly reduce the rate of infections, that we might need to see tougher restrictions in England of the sort that we've got in Scotland and Northern Ireland around preventing households mingling in private homes. So I think there are definitely questions about whether the government is doing enough to reduce risky social contact at this point in time. And I think the fact that you've got some people wanting a greater role for Parliament is because they feel that.
Do you think it's being reflected in this new polling out this weekend, Anna? In June, 65% of voters surveyed backed the government's handling of the crisis. A YouGov poll for Sky News found the majority of Britons, 51%, believe the government was handling it poorly. Sorry, that was in June. So earlier in the year, 65% said that they were doing well. 51% in June said they were handling it poorly. And then the latest poll shows approval for the Johnson administration's management of the pandemic has dropped to 30%.
Yes, and this will be certainly being read carefully within government and within the party as well. So you've seen the approval ratings for Keir Starmer and his party are going up, partly because they have been quite cautious in the way they handle the pandemic. They've done a strategy of not criticising too much, offering broadly constructive criticism and sort of picking their battles, which is quite a good position for them to be in as an opposition that doesn't have to go to an election anytime soon. So we've got that, and it's also something that going into these parliamentary votes is being picked up on. So the whips have been calling around Tory MPs, trying to dissuade them from rebelling next week and using the Keir Starmer excuse as one of the main reasons. So they're saying, don't vote against us, don't constrain us by having to do parliamentary votes on all lockdown measures, because it will play into the opposition's hands. So it's certainly something that the government and the Conservative Party are increasingly aware of.
Okay, fantastic. Sonia, Anna, thanks a lot.